Thank you all so much. I am really honored to have a terrific panel here with me to discuss accelerating the road to net zero. The Biden administration has a goal of getting to net zero before 2050. Other goals sooner of reaching emissions cuts of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And globally, the world has committed to trying to keep global temperatures from blowing past 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1. And so to start off the discussion, Congressman Curtis, let me give a little bit of an introduction here. Congressman Curtis created the Conservative Climate Caucus, and Republicans in Congress are increasingly accepting the science behind climate change, have plans to address climate change. I don't hear a lot about targets, and so I hope we could start with you and talk about how you feel about the net zero target, whether it's something that you think we can get to, we should get to, and to the extent you're comfortable speaking for your party, how Republicans see the net zero target.
So, Lisa, first of all, thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you to the other panelists at Columbia University. Just really pleased to be here. And I'm just going to brag for a minute before I answer your question. There's actually the Conservative Climate Caucus is made up of Republican members of Congress from the House. We have 81 members. That's over a third of all House Republicans are part of this. And the first tenet of the caucus is that the climate is changing and MAD's had some influence on it. So I think that's just really, really important. Now, as far as how we feel and how I feel about this, I'm a goal-oriented person. I think we should have goals. I think we should have targets. And I don't know anybody who doesn't think it's a good idea to have all of our emissions reduced by the year 2050. Sometimes I think Republicans speak a different language. I think that's fair to say when it comes to climate, and we communicate a different way. And so I think sometimes if you feel a pushback on that from Republicans, it's not so much saying that we don't want to do that. Imagine anybody that doesn't think less emissions are better than more emissions. I don't know anybody that doesn't think it'd be great to have zero emissions. But sometimes the way we talk about it is important, and then I also think Republicans are quicker to see obstacles and impediments in the way that we want to talk about, and not just be all, oh yeah, we can all do this, but no, let's talk about how we do it and what's in the way of doing it.
I want to come back to some of those things because I think it's really important that we sort of start from a baseline and are talking about the same things. Ambassador Tubiana, you were as one of the leading figures responsible for the Paris Agreement. 7 years after the creation of the Paris Agreement, where is the world on this net zero goal, and what are the consequences if we don't meet it?
Thank you, Lisa, for this very important question, because on the morning of the 12th of December in Paris in 2015, I can tell you that the target of net zero by 2050 was the last thing we could negotiate at the end. And so at that particular moment, I think the whole world who were signing up for that didn't understand totally what this means. And I think a big progress, of course, since these 7 years. Now, I think every government, every company, every local authority have been interpreting, understanding what does it mean and how to do it, because of course that's the main question. And there I see, of course, and there is a lot of pushback on many fronts, but I see now this notion that it's not an incremental change we have to make, but a very deep one, and that really reducing emission to net zero by 2050 implies a full change in many, many sectors. The good thing we are seeing is that on a number of sectors, we see the advancement. Again, when I was in the 12th December of Paris, I would not have imagined the rapid transformation of the transport sector. It was not there. The electrification of vehicles, of trucks, of many things was not there. Even now, we are even thinking about the net zero aviation, which was again unthinkable at that time because people didn't see the target. Now that there's a target, you have to say how we fulfill the commitment. And that creates enormous innovation and discussion in the system. The same on electricity. Secretary Cole just say how much we have made progress at world level. I think today It seems that the electricity out of renewable energy has been surpassing every fossil fuel production. There is a very interesting report published today. We see that, and so that on the sector side, but we see, even more importantly, the mobilization of the civil society that really now want this to happen and keep the governments accountable, that they promise that. And I can tell you from a European point of view, we see now courts, whether they are Supreme Courts in Germany or in Netherlands, just keeping the government accountable to their promises. So this is really now a whole of society question. And that, I think, the best thing we could get. So I do think at that moment, this is opening new area of transformation. These days, we see the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. Again, in 2015, we could not have imagined that the reform of the two key financial institutions, including the mobilization of the private capital, could happen because of climate. And this is what is happening. So that's the positive side. But there are many, and I'm sure we will discuss that later on, there are many pushback and obstacles.
And we'll get to those for sure. I'm so pleased to have both Manish Bapna and Fred Krupp with us, representing the presidents of Natural Resources Defense Council and Environmental Defense Fund, respectively, two of the most influential environmental groups in the United States. Manish, the United States recently passed, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which invests about $370 billion in clean energy. Does that get us to the net zero goal? Does that get us to the 50 to 52% goal? And if not, what more needs to happen?
Great. Great to be here with all of you today, Lisa. Thank you for the question, and to the panelists. Really important to underscore, the Inflation Reduction Act is by far the single most significant policy that the United States has taken on climate ever. And arguably, if not the most significant, one of the most significant ever taken by any country around the world. And yet it's still not enough, right? So if we think about where we were a couple years ago, I'm going to throw out a few numbers here, which I know you'll like. 30% below 2005 levels was where US emissions were. The president, as Lisa mentioned, made a goal of going to 50 to 52% by 2030. This bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, gets us from 30%, projections say to 40%. A big step, but still far from 50 to 52% by 2030, and still quite a further to go to get to net zero. So three things we need to do to get to the net zero goal. The first is we actually have to implement this policy so that it lives up and, if anything, exceeds its promise. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in implementing this policy over the coming years. Just to pick out one, Congressman talked about some of the barriers to actually deploying clean energy at the speed and scale we need to do. Secretary Granholm was talking about permitting as well. We need to think about how we can actually deploy clean energy at a much faster pace than what we've seen before. Second, how do we get from 40% to 50%? We need to look at standards and rules that the government can take forward at this point in time. Papers today, as both the Secretary and Lisa mentioned, big step forward in terms of vehicle rules. Moving from, in 2022, 6% of sales in the United States was electric vehicles. By 2032, in 10 years, this rule estimates 67% of vehicles, new sales, would be electric vehicles. We need to see rules on vehicles, on power plants, on appliance efficiency standards. We need to see more state ambition. So that's how we get to 50 to 52. But then we got to do some tough stuff of how do we get from 50 to 100. In some of the industrial sectors, how we look at agriculture and forestry, how we think about carbon negative technologies will be important issues to look at in those outer decades. So still a lot more work to be done.
And I think we're going to have a lot of differences of opinion on this panel about both the current regulations that we saw out today from the Biden administration on tailpipe emissions and some of these further efforts, and we'll get into that. But first, let's talk about what can happen in a bipartisan way. Fred, is there anything in this Congress, with Republicans holding the House and Democrats having a thin, razor-thin majority in the Senate, that can happen in this Congress to further the net zero goal?
Yeah, in the world we live in, Lisa, it's not going to be easy, but yes, I am hopeful. I'll be interested in John's view as well. But the three things that come to mind immediately with your question are, one, the Farm Bill, two, the whole subject of resiliency, and three, the subject that Manish has just raised, permitting. That's going to be hard. But the Farm Bill, we are now working with the Farm Bureau and many other farmers in a way that I would not have anticipated just 5 years ago. We have many common positions, many common solutions we're advocating for together. So I am hopeful the Farm Bill is a must-pass bill. I'm hopeful that there can be work between Democrats and Republicans to pass something that moves the agricultural economy forward in several different ways. Resiliency, we are seeing the effects of climate chaos now. We have to take care of people and human needs while we keep lowering emissions. So I'm hopeful, there as well. And permitting is, the Republicans and Democrats are now far apart, but we've got to build this stuff. We've got to do it in a way that respects the concerns of communities, bring them in at the beginning instead of as an afterthought at the end, make sure things that are built improve environmental quality, that there aren't, that we're not, the ends justifies the means, that time for that is over. We've got to make sure the best technologies are used and the best controls are put on not only new facilities, but existing facilities. So I'm hoping permitting is probably the toughest of the three, but ideally we'll make progress there.
Well, let's negotiate the bill here while we're here.
I'm ready.
So
Let's do it.
Republicans passed H.R. 1, the House Republicans passed H.R. 1. Among other things, it does make it easier to cite fossil fuel projects, pipelines and the such. What is the sweet spot? What can Congress do to make it easier to cite transmission lines, renewable energy projects that Republicans will accept, and what will environmental groups like the ones you represent accept on the fossil fuel side?
I wish we could have all day just on this subject, because I actually think this is our single largest impediment to reaching our goals. And let me give you an example of that. In H.R. 1 that Republicans just did, the Congressional Budget Office dinged us. And by dinging us means they said there was a cost to this for permitting reform. Well, how could there be a cost to the federal budget for permitting reform? The answer is because you cannot spend all the dollars in the IRA without permitting reform. And therefore, the Congressional Budget Office predicts that if we get permitting reform, it will unleash the IRA dollars, and if we don't, it won't. And I think that's why this is such an important topic. Now, let me say this. Fred mentioned there's a wide gap between Republicans and Democrats. I'm going to slightly alter that and say there is a bigger gap between Democrats and Democrats on this issue. What do I mean by that?
May I pause? Do you feel that's true by nods of assent or dissent?
I think one of the things that, there are a lot of different views on permitting reform across the political spectrum. I think what is most important is for us to first clarify what is the problem in actually deploying clean energy at the speed and scale we need. I think part of the challenge is that we all have slightly different interpretations of what are the actual barriers. And I think there are first very significant barriers at the local and state level.
Yeah.
I think there's significant barriers not with policy, but with the implementation of existing policy. And third, there are some things Congress does need to do, and we should talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But at least from my standpoint, given what the science says, given what Laurent said, we are not in a place where we should be facilitating, in my mind, more oil and gas. We need to be thinking about a more narrow focus around clean energy and how we build that out at the scale we need.
Let me throw it back
Yeah,
to
so I'm gonna, I can't let this pass. Look, we've reduced more greenhouse gas emissions in this country during the last decade and a half than anybody would have ever guessed possible. We've far exceeded other countries. How have we done that? Well, we've done that with a fossil fuel, natural gas. Think for a minute, our natural gas is about 40% cleaner than Russia. Why aren't we replacing Russian natural gas with US natural gas? Why are we demonizing the fossil fuel industry who's talking about carbon sequestration and direct air capture? They may beat everybody else to net zero, by the way. And so I think it's really important. We have to make a decision. Do we hate fossil fuels or do we hate emissions? And I think we hate emissions.
Yeah.
And fossil fuels can actually play a role. They can be part of the solution and not the problem.
Ambassador Tumiana, let me pose that to you. That this is an argument we hear on the Republican side in the US a lot, that the problem is not the fossil fuels, it is the emissions caused by the fossil fuels. Can we get to net zero without dramatically reducing the fossil fuels themselves?
Well, I take the point that US emission reduction has relied on switching from coal to gas. That's true.
Well, it's not only that, it's how is that natural gas produced and how much methane is coming off that natural gas?
There is, I think Fred can say a lot about methane. And that's very interesting to see how we cut dramatically the methane emission of the sector. But now if you look at the future, there is an impossibility when you look at the carbon budget. And they're really, the first phase, okay, but then you see that a drop to emission to net zero, if you may have a miracle solution of capture of carbon on the, whether in the atmosphere or the exploration and exploitation of gas, oil and gas, but the dimension of the quantity, it just, for the moment, the numbers doesn't fit. And that you have an enormous quantity of carbon which is already there, you add up, and the capacity of storage and capturing is, the cost is very, very high. So I see a contradiction sometimes in the discussion with the oil and gas companies and the government who are supporting that. I'm just talking a lot with our UAE colleagues recently. And they feel that that will be cheap, and by the way, they are, of course, very hostile to any carbon tax. But when you look at the cost of the carbon capture, who will pay for that? You will need something like $100 a ton to capture if we get the cost down. So there is an economic model which is not there. So I think and where the clean electricity, for example, the economic model is there already. And you look at, even as the secretary mentioned, we can have offshore wind at $45 a megawatt. That's the same in Europe now, we are a little higher. And that the progress in emission reduction finally in Europe would have been, of course, stiffer and, than in US for the moment. They have been done out of decarbonizing the activity. So I don't say no to what has happened positively in the fracking sector in US, and we need gas still. We are importing, Europe is importing gas from US now more and more. But we need to say that it is really a transition, and we need to absolutely shift to the clean energy fully. And that, in particular, developed countries has to show the lead, in my view. And if we cannot demonstrate that we can do that, I think the whole world would not do it. And you know, climate is not about US and Europe only, it's about the world. And that, in my view, is a very important signal we have to give.
I just
Fred,
want to jump
yes,
in on
please.
this, Lisa. I think, there could be a role for carbon capture, sequestration. There's a lot of science to be worked out. There's a lot of economics to be worked out there. But the International Energy Agency in Paris, which is the definitive source, says there's no way to get to net zero without a dramatic decline in the use of fossil fuels. On the methane question, we simply don't have the data yet globally that we need to have. Most all the major oil companies, thankfully, have signed up for OGMP, the UN program, which provides for actual empirical measurements and third-party verification. For reasons that I don't understand, Exxon and Chevron, two American companies, are not yet willing to sign up and give the world the data that virtually all the other majors have agreed to. So I don't think we can yet assert exactly how clean American gas is. The Environmental Defense Fund is launching a satellite next January, an $88 million project, and we will make the data available for free in close to real time to everyone so we can see exactly what the statistics are. And I would encourage the oil industry, the story is for them to write. They should be doing everything they can to clean up, but the methane issue is so important. Just one more second on this, because most people don't understand.
We don't talk enough about methane.
That the anthropogenic emissions of methane this year will warm the planet more in the next 10 years than the CO2 from burning all the fossil fuels on the planet in the next 10 years. Now, we have to do something about CO2 because it lasts 100 years, but there's an immediate opportunity for the oil and gas industry to get this issue behind us. And we're going to do everything we can to make that happen in 2023.
So I know you want to respond, but I want to wrap this with a question also for you, Congressman. I know you voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, as did all Republicans. It was a Democrat-driven bill. Do you support the $370 billion in there for clean energy?
Okay, hold that. Let me just respond
Please,
here
go ahead,
and come back to that.
Tack that on at the end.
Listen, if we had eliminated solar based on the fact that it was expensive, we wouldn't be having solar today. If you rule out carbon sequestration and direct air capture because it's expensive, that's a huge mistake. I would prefer that we give the oil and gas industry all of our expectations, right? All of our requirements, and let them decide if they can meet them instead of just ruling them out. Does that make sense? In my experience, they're game for that challenge, right? They're game to let the free market drive this. And if they can't get there with net zero, that's fine, but don't rule them out and give them that shot. Let me come to the Inflation Reduction Act.
Sorry, but if the goal isn't net zero, what is the goal?
Oh, I'm fine with it being, so like it's net zero. Look, I believe in the year 2050, we're going to be talking about three things: reliability, affordability, clean, right? Europe shows you what happens if you only focus on clean. You've also got to focus on reliability and affordability. Those three things will dictate what power sources we'll be using in the year 2050, all three of those things. If every one of the sources of energy has an Achilles heel, by the way, on those three things. If it's renewable, your Achilles heel is reliability and storage. We don't have that yet. We've got to do better at storage if renewables are going to be everything they're going to be. Nuclear has an Achilles heel of at least perceived safety and cost, right? If nuclear is going to be there in 2050, it's got to deal with those things. Fossil fuels has an Achilles heel of emissions, right? Every energy source has an Achilles heel that they have to deal with. And so if we said, look, because your Achilles heel is important to me, I'm going to rule you out, I think that's a huge mistake.
Yeah. And on the Inflation Reduction Act, what
So imagine being a member of Congress in the House and getting a 6,000 page text bill and being asked to vote on it the next morning. It's going to spend $1.7 trillion, right? Is that really the way you want your US government to work? I guarantee you not a single one of my colleagues read that bill. Not one of them read that bill. They couldn't have read that bill. We saw what happened in Europe's reaction to some of the things that were in that bill that nobody really even knew was there. Plus, it was spending $1.7 trillion. If you said, John, what would you spend $1.7 trillion on to reduce emissions? That would be a lot of fun, right? Even $300 billion, that would be a lot of fun. To me, it felt like shoot, ready, aim. And I wish that we would be more specific and more calculated in our efforts. We have a limited number of dollars. Let's spend them very wisely and carefully.
So to be clear, most of this this is not like the Obama era bill where we're putting money into ready-made projects. A lot of these are tax credits and subsidies. Still government spending, but
well, they also pick the solution. So, for instance, we have ordained electric vehicles the answer. What about hydrogen, right?
let's talk about hydrogen. I mean, that's a huge part of this bill.
Yeah,
isn't it,
but yet we've predetermined that it's going to be EV. We're putting charging stations around the country, and we don't know that EVs are the answer, and we don't know where the electricity is going to come from to get to those charging stations, and we don't have the capacity to carry that energy to those charging stations. So shouldn't somebody have asked that question?
Well, I think
clarify, sorry, pardon me, but to clarify, then you oppose the $370 billion for the...
It's not as easy as oppose or unoppose. I have questions about it,
Okay.
right?
I think, Congressman, the die is cast that electric vehicles are the way of the future. They're 7% of US market sales right now, much higher in Europe. There's $134 billion in US manufacturing projects that have been announced. Half of them, since IRA was passed, will create 140,000 new jobs. Actually, the bill is technology neutral. Hydrogen fuel cells could qualify. It's the consumer and the industry that are saying electric cars are a far more efficient way to use energy. And while we're on the topic of hydrogen, I just want to say that most people don't know yet, hydrogen is indirectly a greenhouse gas in 3 different ways. So hydrogen leaks are going to be viewed as similar to methane leaks. And here we have the opportunity before the hydrogen infrastructure is built, and hydrogen can be useful for certain hard-to-abate sectors, but we have the chance to get it right.
So let me just first of all say, you can't
Very
tell
quickly,
this, but
'cause
there's far more we agree on than we disagree. But I will point out that a Chevy Hummer, an electric Chevy Hummer, produces more greenhouse gas emissions than a gas-powered Chevy Malibu. And yet we're giving you $7,500 to that purchase of that Hummer. Those are the types of questions I think we need to be asking.
Okay, let's broaden this a little bit. Ambassador Tubiana, the United States, Europe has been pushing, as others have been pushing the United States for decades to act in a significant way on climate change. And now that we have, nobody likes the way we're doing it. So, so tell us a little bit about Europe's response, and are we going to see a green, subsidies trade war?
Well, first of all, we have really, in Europe, the IRA was welcome. It was really welcome to see US taking much more seriously than before this target of net zero and implementation. On the other side, of course, there are trade consequences. There was even a trade discussion on the steel, you remember, when the EU will install its carbon border adjustment mechanism. US came immediately to say, look, what we do with our steel, because the carbon intensity of our steel is higher than what you have in EU. So there are trade consequences to all the policies we are designing, and that's fine to discuss that. I see there are, so as the Secretary said, there could be a race to the top. The Green Deal in Europe has effectively gone to really reduce emission in a significant way. We are very close to the 55% emission reduction compared to 1990 in Europe, and we can do even better. I think we will announce better numbers this year before the COP28. But this, of course, was not focused because we have this instrument, which is the emission trading system, the carbon price for industry. So now we are entering in a good phase, which is a race to the top. That will have trade consequences. And I would like to focus on 2 elements. One, we have to, in a way, limit these trade conflicts. Imagine that if we have a good conversation on the norms setting, on the standards, and even, on the regulation of the financial market, because ESG discussion, I know here it's very sensitive. In Europe, it's just much more normal. We could have not only a positive race to the top, but we could have the sign to the global market that will define the economy for the future. It is a historical moment for EU and US, because in maybe 10 years or 20 years' time, we will have a so powerful Asian market that if we don't define the norms and standards now, we will not be able to define them in the future. So I think, I understand there will be, of course, subsidies and industrial policy in EU, and that's a good result of IRA. But we need to see to diminish this trade tension, trying to, in a way, harmonize as a maximum we can, so as there is this consequence of a global market incentive. So that's, I see, the very important element. And the industrial plan should not, if we go to trade war, we will diminish the effort for climate fight, and we'll leave too much space to others. But there is an issue about how effective emission reduction are. And I think we may have very different instruments. You don't have a carbon tax in US. We have one in this form in EU. And I think it's really important to look at the content of the carbon. And I think that could be a signal to the rest of the economy. The electric cars, the Chinese electric cars that will come to the markets in Europe and maybe in US, well, that will have a significant difference if we can prove that they are as good in carbon content that we are trying to build them. And that is really something to shift from a trade protectionist perspective to something that it is a zero carbon economy that could facilitate trade. And I think we need to work much more between US and EU on that aspect.
Just turning back to the US, we have a question from a student. To what extent is public health tied to decarbonization? Can we kill two birds with one stone? Maybe Manish or Fred?
Sure. Just two small points. One, I want to just talk a little bit about technology for one moment and technology choice, and then I want to take the public health question. Just as we look over the past few decades, we just want a little bit of a note of caution about embracing certain technologies that we don't fully understand. 20 years ago, all this investment around CCS for the power sector didn't quite get the scale that we needed to see, probably not going to be a major solution for the power sector. 10, 15 years ago, all the rage was around biofuels. A lot of the first generation biofuels didn't adequately account for a lot of the land use impacts. So the emissions for biofuels were much greater than we thought. And I say that because as we talk about hydrogen, there are a lot of different colors of hydrogen: blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, pink hydrogen, green hydrogen. How the hydrogen is produced and deployed is incredibly important to make sure we can capture the climate benefits. There's a great saying, hydrogen is like the champagne of energy technologies. It should be used sparingly and on special occasions. And I think that's true, and we want to make sure we do develop hydrogen, but we use it sparingly. On the public health questions, this is one of the themes we haven't brought out as much is just how the energy transition is not only good in terms of jobs, innovation, and growth. It absolutely is. Fred cited some important statistics on that, but how it also can create much cleaner air, and really support public health. A lot of frontline communities, a lot of environmental justice communities living in and around power plants, petrochemical plants. There's a real opportunity to actually make significant steps to not only create a manufacturing renaissance in this country, but to actually take significant steps to clean up the air for some of the most marginalized communities in this country. And
Yeah,
so there's a lot of benefits here.
I'm going to give you a carbon tax question because we have limited time, and I think this is up your alley. We're asked, is an economy-wide carbon tax a realistic policy in the U.S. at this point?
Not in this Congress. But over time, we have to price these externalities, and then the economy, will self-correct and clean up pollution, whether that's a carbon tax or cap and trade. But an irony, Lisa, is that we did pass in IRA a version of a carbon tax, a methane tax. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And this is something that Exxon actually has been calling for a carbon tax for years. So we get this methane tax enacted, and now the American Petroleum Institute, an arm of the big oil companies, is fighting to get Congressman Curtis and his colleagues in Congress. There's a bill pending now, Congressional Review Act, to repeal this methane tax. The duplicity is astounding. We have a price now on a greenhouse gas, and yet there's an effort to repeal it. So, the oil and gas companies have said, we want good policy, and yet at least some of them, through their trade association, once we have the policy, are now working to claw it back.
Everybody wants to respond to that, so let me.
Nobody's approached me to repeal that.
Okay.
Nobody has asked me to repeal that.
I'm going to give you the last word, but Laurence, you wanted to.
Yeah, I wanted to add a point we should not forget. It's very important to talk about US-EU relation, but don't forget the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And if we have our policies, and we have to have strong carbon emission reduction policies, absolutely essential. We have to do the job at home. We can and look at how the world is fragmented, and that was actually the topic of the first panel this morning. How Brazil, many Latin American countries, many African countries and Asian are looking to China for their trade, and that's most of the time their main trade partner. So we have to consider how domestic policy don't isolate us from the rest, because we need the transition to happen everywhere. And so we need to encourage, as well as we do our domestic policy and reinforce and reshore industry, which is fine, and I think everybody has to do that. But at the same time, we have to offer economic space to others to do that transition in a global economy. We will not. And that, in my view, is totally missing in the discussion today. And it's a very big danger if we don't want to be the one clean on one side and all the other one no paying attention. And I think we are in a crucial moment about that.
Thank you. I'm going to give you the last word, Congressman. We've seen a little bit of the stark political divide play out here. Can we get to net zero given the political divisions around even how we get there?
So even before you asked that question, I was regretting that you may walk away with the impression that there's so much we disagree on. And I will just tell you, there are many conversations with my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, particularly right now. It's reaching kind of a fevered pitch on permitting reform, about a path forward and about working together. And there's really far more that we literally agree on than we disagree. And I think I'm optimistic on permitting reform. I think that we can find a path forward. There's too much pressure on both sides not to find a path forward on permitting reform.
I'm going to lock the three of you in a room afterwards.
Yeah, you know, and I think we probably could. If you just gave it to the three of us, we'd have it solved by the afternoon. So I do want the audience to know that there are many good Republicans and Democrats who are thoughtful about this issue, who are working together and trying to find solutions together on not just permitting reform, but a lot of the things that we've talked about today.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank our panelists, and I'm sure we're going to continue the discussion backstage.
Thank you to each of our speakers. Thank you to each of our moderators this morning.